how an early failure sealed the Biffle crash. The second NTSB briefing tells us where the jet was and how it was configured in those final moments. What it doesn't explain is why the crew's plan kept changing in the first few minutes after takeoff. And that matters, because the real anomaly here isn't the final approach. It's what happened before the airplane ever committed to landing. If this were a simple engine failure followed by a routine return, we'd expect one clean climb, one clean turn, and one stabilized setup. That's not what the data shows. Instead, the flight never quite settles into a rhythm. So before we talk about outcomes, before we talk about impact, we need to talk about process. Because accidents don't always begin at the moment of ground contact. They often begin when a flight never finds its rhythm, when the crew never gets ahead of the airplane, when every second remains a struggle for stability. Let's break it down. When investigators look at early ADS-B data from an accident like this, they're not just looking for altitude loss. They're not just measuring how high or how low the aircraft was. They're looking for patterns, for trends, for signatures in the data that tell a story about what was happening in that cockpit. And one pattern stands out here, a pattern that's subtle but significant. A repeated series of climbs and descents. Not a single continuous descent toward the airport. Not a clean climb out followed by a level turn and then a return descent. But a profile that looks uneven, almost oscillating. Almost like the airplane is searching for a stable state and not quite finding one. It would be easy to look at this data and simply describe it as descending, as the aircraft coming down to land. But that description misses the point entirely. What matters isn't the net change in altitude over time. What matters is the interruption of stabilization, the inability to establish a steady state. In a normal departure, even with a serious problem, even with an engine failure or another emergency, there's usually a moment where things settle down. Power is set to a specific value. Pitch is established at a specific angle. Trim is adjusted. The airplane finds a steady rhythm, a stable configuration, and that rhythm, that stability, gives the crew space to think, space to plan, space to execute checklists and make decisions. Here, that rhythm appears elusive. Multiple climb and descent transitions suggest that the crew may have been repeatedly retrimming the airplane, changing configuration, adjusting power settings, or responding to performance behavior that wasn't matching their expectations. None of that implies loss of control. The airplane wasn't departing from controlled flight, it wasn't spinning or stalling. But what it does imply is work, constant work. It implies the crew was actively managing something that kept demanding attention, something that wouldn't settle down and let them establish a stable platform. This is where it helps to introduce a concept that doesn't get talked about much outside of professional cockpit debriefs, outside of accident investigation circles, what we might call procedural turbulence. Now, procedural turbulence isn't air turbulence. It's not weather, it's not rough air bouncing the airplane around. It's task turbulence, cognitive turbulence. It happens when abnormal indications, ambiguous quiz, unclear performance data, or unexpected aircraft behavior prevent a crew from ever reaching a clean, steady operating state. Instead of moving smoothly from one stable phase of flight to the next, takeoff to climb, climb to cruise, cruise to descent, the crew stays stuck in transition. They never complete one phase and move cleanly into the next. They're constantly in between states, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting. Transitions are high workload by definition. They involve configuration changes, power changes, cross-checks between instruments, call-outs between crew members, verification of systems. They are manageable, they are routine when they are brief, when they last 30 seconds or a minute and then resolve into something stable. They become dangerous when they never end, when the transition state persists for minutes without resolution. And that's the key insight here, one that's easy to miss if you're just looking at altitude or speed numbers. Accidents don't always start with a dramatic loss of control. Sometimes they start with a failure to ever regain normal rhythm after an abnormal event. When the airplane never quite settles, neither does the crew's workload. Every second remains busy. Every moment demands attention, even if nothing overtly dramatic is happening. There's no catastrophic failure cascading through the aircraft. There's no structural breakup. There's just constant small adjustments, constant small corrections, constant reevaluation of what the airplane is doing versus what it should be doing. And all of this matters because the crew is burning margin the entire time. Not altitude margin yet, not airspeed margin necessarily, but cognitive margin, attention margin, capacity margin, the mental reserves that you need to handle the next problem, to make the next decision, to catch the next error, those reserves are being depleted continuously without being replenished by a stable phase of flight. And all of this procedural turbulence is happening before the airplane ever commits to a landing path, before they're on final approach, before they're configured for landing, before any of the things we traditionally think of as the critical phase. So when we later see what might look like a rushed setup or compressed decision-making or configuration choices that seem questionable, it's worth remembering that the crew may have already been operating at elevated workload for several minutes without the relief, without the breathing room of a stable phase in between. This section of the analysis isn't about being low on approach. It's about something that came earlier, something more subtle, a climb profile that never fully resolved into something steady, something stable, something that would let the crew catch their breath and get organized. If you're finding this analysis valuable, if you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We go deeper than headlines here. We look at the human factors, the decisions, the cognitive traps that turn manageable emergencies into tragedies. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next breakdown. Now, let's talk about planning, but not in terms of runway numbers or geometric approaches or wind direction. Instead, let's talk about how many plans were in play, how many times the plan changed. Early in the return, based on the flight track data, the airplane appears to be aligned toward one runway, apparently setting up for an approach in one direction. Later, that plan is abandoned. The aircraft changes heading. Then the aircraft re-enters a different pattern, apparently setting up for another runway, a different approach path. Those facts by themselves don't imply error. Crews change plans all the time. Weather changes, winds shift, ATC gives different instructions, equipment considerations come into play. Changing plans is normal and often appropriate. The issue here isn't that the plan changed. The issue is how often the plan changed and under what conditions those changes were happening. From a cognitive standpoint, from a human factors perspective, what this suggests is that the crew wasn't executing a single well-defined return plan. They were replanning while airborne, replanning while the airplane was moving, replanning while other tasks were demanding attention. And every time a plan changes, even slightly, even in a seemingly minor way, new questions appear, new decisions cascade. Do we keep the current configuration, or do we change it? Do we continue this turn, or do we need to widen it to accommodate the new approach? Do we need to rebrief the approach? Do crew roles change? Does someone need to take the radios? Does someone need to focus exclusively on monitoring performance parameters? These questions don't come one at a time, politely waiting for answers. They come in clusters. They arrive simultaneously, and they often arrive while the airplane is already in motion, already configured for the previous plan, already committed to a turn or a descent profile. This is why decision churn matters, why it's a risk factor that doesn't always show up clearly in accident reports. Each plan change adds new configuration decisions. Do we need flaps now or later? Do we put the gear down now or wait? It adds timing pressure because the airplane doesn't pause while you rethink the plan. The airplane keeps flying, keeps moving through space, keeps getting closer to the ground, and it adds coordination demands because both people in the cockpit, assuming there are two effective crew members, need to be aligned on what the new plan actually is. They need shared understanding of where they're going, how they're getting there, what configuration they'll use, what speeds they'll fly. What's important to understand here is that this isn't about runway geometry. It's not about whether an opposite direction landing is safe or unsafe in general. It's not about whether turning left or right is better. This is about decision fragmentation, about cognitive load distribution. When a crew has one clear plan, even a demanding plan, even a complex approach in difficult conditions, workload can be effectively shared and prioritized. Each person knows their role. Tasks can be divided. Checklists can be executed in order. But when the plan keeps evolving, when it's changing every 30 or 60 seconds, workload multiplies in ways that aren't linear. Tasks start to overlap. Some items get deferred because there's no time right now. Others get rushed because they should have been done already under the previous plan. Dependencies between tasks become unclear. And here's the subtle part, the part that's easy to miss from outside the cockpit. This can happen even if everyone is calm, professional, and well-intentioned. Plan churn increases workload faster than any checklist item ever could, faster than any single task or procedure. Not because checklists are bad or procedures are flawed, but because replanning, especially continuous replanning, consumes the very resource checklists and procedures are meant to protect. Attention, cognitive bandwidth, mental capacity. When you're constantly making new decisions about the plan itself, you have less capacity left to execute any particular plan well. By the time the airplane is lined up for its final attempt, for whatever approach they ultimately committed to, the crew may already be mentally behind the airplane. Not because of panic, not because of confusion or lack of skill, but because they've been managing change after change after change without a pause to consolidate, without a moment to get organized and get ahead. That's why this matters for understanding the accident sequence. Not because any single plan they considered was necessarily wrong, not because turning back itself was the problem, but because the act of repeatedly changing plans may have quietly, invisibly, narrowed the crew's margin long before those final moments, long before the final approach, long before anything looked obviously wrong from the outside. There's a phase of abnormal flight that rarely shows up clearly in data plots, in ADS-B tracks, in radar replays, and it often doesn't sound dramatic on cockpit voice recordings either. There's no shouting, no alarms, no obvious crisis. It's the space between recognizing that something isn't right and deciding what that something actually is. The gap between knowing you have a problem and knowing what problem you have. In this accident, that gap likely occurred very early, shortly after liftoff, but before any stabilized return path existed, before any clear plan had formed. And it's an important phase to understand because it's often where many well-intentioned decisions, many reasonable-seeming choices, begin to narrow options instead of expanding them. After takeoff, especially after an abnormal event, crews don't always get a clear, unambiguous warning that says exactly what the problem is. Modern aircraft have sophisticated warning systems, but those systems can't always immediately diagnose complex or unusual failure modes. More often, what crews get are partial cues, a vibration that doesn't match previous experience or expectations, performance that feels slightly off, slightly different from normal, control pressures that don't line up with what the pilot anticipates based on configuration and power settings, maybe an instrument parameter that's technically within limits, technically in the green, but trending the wrong way, moving toward a limit faster than expected. None of those cues by themselves necessarily demand a specific immediate response. A slight vibration might be temporary, slightly reduced performance might be acceptable, an instrument trend might stabilize. And that's exactly what makes this phase so demanding, so cognitively difficult. There's not enough information to know for certain what's wrong, but there's enough information to know that something has changed, something is different. Investigators will likely ask, and this is a standard part of any investigation, whether the crew was dealing with ambiguous information in those early moments. Signals that something had changed, that something had degraded or failed, but without clarity on exactly what had failed, how serious it was, what secondary effects might develop. In that environment, in that fog of uncertainty, crews often feel pressure, both internal pressure and sometimes external pressure, to do something before they fully understand what they're dealing with. The instinct is to take action, to make a decision, to demonstrate control of the situation. And returning to the airport often feels like a safe, conservative move. It feels reversible, like you're not committing to anything irreversible. It feels like you're reducing risk by getting the airplane back on the ground at a familiar airport with a known runway. But in practice, in actual execution, initiating a return can commit the flight to a high workload path before some critical things have been established. Before crew roles are clearly defined, before it's clear who's flying and who's managing systems, before automation, if available, is set up to help reduce workload, before the crew has had a chance to step back, even briefly, and ask the fundamental question, what problem are we actually solving here? What exactly is wrong, and what does that imply for how we should proceed? Once that return path is chosen, once the turn back toward the airport begins, the airplane keeps moving and tasks start accumulating. Turns have to be flown, headings have to be managed. Configurations have to be considered and changed. Radios still need attention, even if not in contact with ATC, there's monitoring to be done. And all of this activity happens while the crew is still sorting out, still trying to understand What's normal and what isn't in the current state of the aircraft? What indications can be trusted? What performance can be expected? What limitations now apply that didn't apply before? The key point here, and this builds on what we discussed earlier but from a different angle, is not urgency. We already explored the risks of rushing in depth. This is about timing, about sequence. Early action, action taken before diagnosis is complete, can lock a crew into a sequence of tasks, a chain of required actions that leaves little room to slow things down later, little room to pause and reconsider. And if that action happens before responsibilities are clearly divided between crew members, or before automation modes are engaged to reduce manual workload, or before the crew has had a chance to brief even a basic plan, task saturation can develop quietly, gradually, without any obvious single moment of overload. There's no sudden spike in workload, it just gradually builds and never comes back down. From the outside, to an observer, it can look like a prompt, professional response. Crew recognizes a problem, initiates a return, begins maneuvering back to the airport. Textbook. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people in that cockpit, it can feel very different. It can feel like trying to build a plan while already executing it, like trying to organize your thoughts while simultaneously managing a moving, changing, demanding situation. That's why this gap, this phase between problem recognition and problem understanding matters so much. Not because it proves anything definitive yet, not because we can draw final conclusions, but because it's often where options begin to narrow, where margins begin to erode, long before anyone realizes how constrained the situation has become. Now, let's talk about configuration, but not as simple preparation for landing, not as a checklist item. Instead, let's talk about configuration as commitment, as an energy decision with consequences that aren't always immediately obvious. In aviation, especially in training, configuration changes are often treated as neutral procedural steps. Gear down is a step on the approach checklist. Flaps to 15 is a step. Flaps to full is a step. They're part of the normal flow, part of what you do on every approach. But in jets, in aircraft with relatively high wing loading and specific performance characteristics, configuration changes are not passive. They are not neutral. They reshape the airplane's energy state, its ability to accelerate or climb or arrest a descent, in ways that aren't always intuitive, especially under abnormal conditions. Early use of landing gear or flaps increases drag. That's expected, that's the whole point, to slow the airplane down and increase lift at lower speeds. What's less intuitive, what's not always fully appreciated until you're in the situation, is how quickly that drag can reduce climb authority or glide performance, especially if the airplane is already dealing with abnormal performance, reduced thrust from one engine or degraded systems, or if thrust margins are thinner than usual due to weight or altitude or temperature. Investigators will likely explore, this is standard procedure, whether configuration changes occurred at a point where the airplane still needed flexibility, still needed the option to climb or accelerate or go around. This isn't about accusing the crew of a specific error, of dirtying up too early as the saying goes. It's about understanding, reconstructing, how each configuration choice may have quietly, incrementally, removed escape options, reduced the envelope of possible actions. Once gear is down and flaps are extended to landing configuration, the airplane becomes more honest in a sense. It will do exactly what physics allows based on its current energy state and no more. If additional thrust or pitch input doesn't produce the expected response, doesn't arrest the descent or increase the climb rate, there may be no configuration left to reverse, no way to clean up the airplane without significant altitude to work with. And if you're already low, already close to the ground, that altitude may not be available. This is where an important subtle distinction comes in, one that's easy to overlook. A jet can be perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. It can be perfectly under control, wings level, nose pointing the right direction. It can even feel stable to the crew, not obviously divergent or out of control, and still be unable to arrest a descent once fully configured, once drag has been added and energy has been bled off. That situation doesn't require a dramatic failure. It doesn't require loss of control or a stall or a spin. It only requires an energy state that has already been committed, already been locked in by configuration choices, with no margin left to trade for climb or reduced descent rate. This is why configuration isn't just preparation for landing. It's a decision, an energy management decision, often an irreversible one. And like many decisions in aviation, it's one that becomes much harder or impossible to undo once made. You can't quickly retract gear and flaps at low altitude and low airspeed without creating other risks, without potentially exceeding limitations or losing control. In early analysis, in preliminary investigation, investigators won't assume that configuration timing caused the outcome. That would be premature. But they will ask. They will carefully examine whether configuration timing aligned with the airplane's actual performance capability at that moment in that condition. Because once configuration locks in a certain drag profile, the airplane's options narrow sharply, dramatically. And if that happens while the crew is still managing other tasks, still trying to diagnose problems, still adjusting the plan, recovery windows can close silently, invisibly, without any clear warning, without any obvious indication that you've just passed the point where a go-around or climb is possible. This is not a visual illusion issue. It's not about misreading altitude or misperceiving the glide path. It's not a loss of control issue in the traditional sense of departure from controlled flight. It's an energy management issue, an energy state problem, one that can exist and develop even when everything looks orderly from the outside, even when the airplane appears to be under control and properly configured. These are some of the hardest accidents to understand because there's no single dramatic moment, no obvious point where things went wrong. It's a gradual, quiet erosion of options until suddenly there are none left. This accident, when the final report is completed, won't ultimately hinge on weather conditions. It won't hinge on runway alignment or which direction they were landing. It won't even hinge necessarily on the final seconds before impact. It will hinge on how quickly complexity accumulated in the cockpit after the initial problem and how little margin remained once that complexity had built up layer by layer. The follow-up data, the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, the detailed wreckage examination won't just tell us what the airplane was doing in terms of altitude and speed and configuration. It will help explain, help reconstruct how the crew's options narrowed step by step, decision by decision, before anyone fully realized how constrained the situation had become, how little room for error remained. That's why early analysis matters, why we're spending time on these phases that happen before the final approach, not to assign blame, not to guess outcomes or jump to conclusions, but to understand, to really understand how reasonable decisions that seemed appropriate in the moment, made by competent people under evolving, uncertain conditions can quietly stack up, can accumulate, until there's very little room left to maneuver, very little margin left for any additional problem or any small error. As more information becomes available from the investigation, as the NTSB releases additional data and analysis, we'll revisit this accident with the same discipline, the same careful approach, separating what we know from what we think, separating facts from speculation, and always keeping the focus where it belongs, on learning enough, understanding deeply enough to reduce the risk of the next one, to help the next crew in a similar situation have better options and better outcomes. Thank you for watching this breakdown. If you found this analysis valuable, if you want to continue learning from these accidents in a way that goes beyond the headlines and the surface level coverage, please subscribe to the channel. Click that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell so you're notified when we release the next video. We're committed to bringing you in-depth analysis that helps you understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what we can learn from it. Your support through subscribing, liking, and sharing these videos helps us continue doing this work. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.